Montana Territory, June 1883. The church bell tolled once, sharp as a rifle crack, and Zadie Weller turned from the altar with tears streaking her powdered cheeks and her breath catching like she had been gut-punched. Her bouquet dropped to the church floor, scattering pale yellow prairie roses across the aisle. She didn't look back, not at the preacher, not at her father's stunned face, and not at the man she nearly married. She ran. Boots pounding the dirt road, lace hem dragging behind her, Zadie sprinted past the rows of wagons and buggies, past the folding chairs someone had set up under the cottonwoods. Folks called out after her, but she didn't hear a word through the roaring in her ears. Her corset bit into her ribs, but she didn't stop. Not until she reached the edge of the meadow, where the grass rolled down into the valley and the mountains stood quiet and watching. Behind her, back at the church, Everett Cole was already untying his bay gelding, jaw tight, hands sure. He did not hesitate. He swung into the saddle and rode hard, the brim of his hat pulled low, eyes locked on the trail of trampled wildflowers and dropped hairpins she had left behind. Zadie had always run when the world crushed in too close. As a girl, she had run from her mother's deathbed, from the silence of their empty house, from the weight of being the only child of a rancher who drank more than he spoke. Everett had found her then, too barefoot in the barn loft, hair tangled and cheeks stained. He had sat beside her, not saying a word, just passing her a tin cup of water and waiting until she could breathe again. That was over a decade ago. But some things did not change. She had not meant to run today. She had stood in that white dress, with the whole town packed into the little clapboard church, and the preacher's voice echoing off the rafters, and she had tried to be still. But when she looked into Levy Macall's eyes, cold, sharp, unreadable, she had known. She could not marry a man who looked at her like a prize horse going to auction, so she ran. When Everett found her, she was down by the river, sitting on a flat rock, her dress muddy and her veil hanging off one side of her head. "I figured you'd come here," he said, reining in beside her. Zadie didn't look up. "You should go back. Tell them I changed my mind." "I reckon they know that part already." She let out a shaky laugh. "You always did have a way with words." Everett dismounted and tied his horse to a low branch. He walked over and sat beside her, close but not touching. "You all right?" he asked after a minute. "No," he nodded like he understood. "Can you tell me what happened?" She looked at him then, eyes red and full of something raw. "I was standing there, thinking about the rest of my life, about waking up next to him, about the way he never listens when I speak, and I couldn't breathe. I couldn't make myself say the words." Everett studied her. "So you ran." "I ran." She looked away again, fingers digging into her skirt. "I should have said something before. I should have called it off, but I kept thinking maybe it would get better. Maybe I was just scared, but I wasn't scared of marriage. I was scared of marrying the wrong man." Everett's voice was low. "Then you did the right thing." They sat in silence, the river murmuring beside them. He reached over, slow and careful, and brushed a bit of dried grass from her sleeve. "I can take you home," he said. "Not the ranch, your real home, the one you want. You say the word." Zadie's throat tightened. "What if I don't know where that is?" Everett turned to her, his eyes steady. "Then we will find it together." She blinked at him, surprised by the weight in his voice. "Why would you do that?" He looked away, jaw flexing. "Because I care about you, Zadie. Always have." That truth hung between them like smoke in still air. She had known it once, long ago, when they were children, and he would fill her coat pockets with apples or chase off boys who teased her for being quiet. But she had buried it under years of silence and growing up and trying to be someone her father would approve of. Zadie stared at Everett, realizing that the only time she had ever felt safe was when he was near. She stood slowly, brushing off her skirt. "Take me home." He rose beside her and offered his hand. She took it. They rode double on his horse, her arms wrapped around his waist, her cheek against his back. The sun lowered behind them, casting long shadows over the hills. By the time they reached Everett's cabin on the edge of Clearwater Ridge, the sky had turned orange and purple. He swung down and helped her off, his hands warm around her waist. "You can stay here tonight. There's a spare room." "I'll ride into town in the morning. Let your father know you're safe." Zadie nodded, too tired to speak. Inside, the cabin was warm and simple wood walls, braided rugs, a table set for one. Everett lit a lantern and motioned to the chair. "Sit, I'll fix something." "No," she said softly. "Let me help." They cooked together without speaking much, just the sounds of the skillet and the clink of dishes. When they sat down to eat, she reached across the table and touched his hand. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her then, really looked. "You are not a burden, Zadie. You never were." Tears welled up in her eyes again, but this time they didn't fall. That night, after she lay down in the spare room and Everett had gone quiet in the one across the hall, she stared at the ceiling and realized something had shifted. Maybe she had not walked away from her life. Maybe she had walked toward it. And maybe, just maybe, it had been waiting for her all along. By morning, the sky outside Everett's cabin held the hush of pale gray light, the kind that softened the edge of everything it touched. Zadie stood at the window of the spare room, her hands resting on the sill, watching a pair of deer cross through the tall grass beyond the split-rail fence. Their movement was careful, unhurried. Behind her, the room still held the scent of pine soap and old quilts. She'd slept, but not deeply. Her mind had wandered too far in the dark through corners of memory she hadn't let herself visit in years, through questions with no answers yet. She didn't hear Everett approach until he knocked once on the frame of the open door. "I've got coffee on," he said. "And there's bread warming by the fire." Zadie turned, brushing her hair back from her face. "That sounds like something I could manage to keep down." "I'll take that as a yes," he said, and stepped back to let her pass. She followed him into the main room. The hearth held a steady flame, and the coffee kettle sat beside it, steaming gently. A small loaf rested on a tin plate wrapped in cloth. She took a seat at the table while he poured 2 cups and set one by her hand. "Thanks," she murmured, wrapping her fingers around it. He sat across from her, elbows on the worn tabletop. "Your father's not going to be pleased." Zadie lifted the cup, letting the warmth settle into her palms. "He stopped listening to what pleased me years ago." Everett didn't answer right away. The fire crackled and the wind tugged at the shutters. "I rode out before sunrise," he said finally. "Told him you were safe. He didn't say much, just nodded and poured himself another drink." Zadie looked up. "Did Levy say anything?" "Didn't see him. His rig was gone." She nodded, lips pressed tight. "He'll move on." "He always does." Everett leaned back, studying her. "And you, what now?" Zadie took a slow sip. "I thought I'd feel lost, like I'd broken something I couldn't mend, but all I feel is, still, like the noise in my head finally quit." He nodded. "That's something worth holding on to." She looked at him then, her gaze steady. "You've always been sure-footed, Everett, even when we were little. You knew where to put your weight in a river crossing, how to read a sky. You knew how to wait for things to be right." "I've had time to learn," he replied, "and I never saw much sense in rushing what needs to take root." Zadie broke off a piece of bread and held it in her fingers. "When I was 16, I thought I was in love with you." He blinked, startled. "You never said." "No, I didn't know what to do with it. You were off working cattle with your brothers. You'd come back sunburnt and quiet, and I'd sit on the porch pretending not to watch you." Everett tilted his head. "I remember that summer. You'd always have your nose in some book, but you'd stop reading when I walked past. I was hoping you'd say something, anything. I didn't think I had the right." Zadie gave a breathless laugh, shaking her head. "You were the only one who ever did." They sat in silence, the kind that didn't press or weigh, the kind that simply held space. After a moment, Everett said, "You could stay here for a time. Till you decide what you want." Zadie looked around the room, the hand-hewn beams, the shelf lined with jars of dried herbs, the pair of boots by the door. "What if I already know?" Everett met her eyes, slow and unflinching. "Then say it plain." She stood, walked to the window again. The sun was rising now, warm gold spreading over the hills. "I want a life that's quiet and honest. I want mornings like this. I want to build something with someone who doesn't need fixing, just choosing." Everett rose too, crossing to stand beside her. "I've been waiting to be chosen by you for a long time," he said. Zadie turned to him. "You still want that after all this?" "I never stopped." She reached for his hand. He took it, rough palm against hers, steady as the land beneath them. Outside, the day opened slow and sure. Inside, they stood together, no longer reaching, no longer waiting. Just 2 souls who had finally found their way forward. By late afternoon, the wind had picked up enough to lift dust from the dry ridges along the southern slope. Everett stood beside the woodshed, splitting kindling, while Zadie knelt in the garden rows behind the cabin, her sleeves rolled up as she tugged chickweed from between the sprouting beans. Her dress was stained at the knees, and her hair had come loose in strands that clung to her cheek. She didn't bother fixing it. When she straightened to ease the pull in her back, Everett leaned the axe against the chopping stump and made his way over. "You ever worked a garden before?" he asked, stopping just short of the fence. Zadie brushed her palms over her skirt. "My mother kept one before she passed. I used to help her with the carrots, but mostly I just liked the feel of the soil." Everett rested his arms on the top rail. "You've got a good hand. Rows look cleaner already." She tilted her head. "I wasn't sure if you'd want me messing with your planting. There are beans now," he said. "Far as I see it." Zadie lowered her gaze, but her fingers curled around the stem of a young sprout and held there. "You think it's that simple?" "No," he said. "But I think it can be honest." She stood and dusted off her hands. "You've got quiet ways, Everett Cole, but you say more than most men ever do," he shrugged. "I never saw the point in talking circles." They walked back toward the cabin together, side by side. The silence between them wasn't heavy, just full of unspoken things that didn't need rushing. As they reached the porch, Everett paused to unlace his boots, but Zadie stepped past the door and into the warm interior. She moved to the shelves by the hearth, her fingers trailing over the worn spines of a few dog-eared books stacked between jars of beans and dried mint. "Did you read all these?" "Most. My brother Caleb left them when he headed south. Said I'd need something to keep my mind from rusting." She turned, holding up a collection of essays bound in cracked leather. "Mind seems in good working order to me." Everett took the book from her, flipping it open to a pressed feather tucked between the pages. "I read this one when I didn't know what to do after my mother passed. Helped some." Zadie stepped closer. "What do you do now when you don't know what to do?" He looked at her then, the book still open in his hands. "I listen." "To what?" "To what stays quiet longest." "That's usually the thing worth paying attention to." Zadie's breath caught, but she didn't look away. "And what's been quiet the longest for you?" He closed the book and set it down. "Want." A long pause stretched between them. The fire popped behind the grate. Zadie reached up and touched the collar of his shirt, her fingers grazing the fabric. "Then maybe it's time to let Want speak." Everett took her hand, cradling it between both of his. "I've waited a long time for you to look at me like this." "I'd wait longer if you needed." "I don't," she said, her voice sure. "I just needed to stop pretending I didn't already know where I belonged." He leaned in then, slow and certain, and she met him halfway. Their first kiss wasn't rushed, it was the kind that had waited its turn, the kind that asked nothing except to be remembered. When they parted, Everett rested his forehead against hers. "You're not going back, are you?" Zadie shook her head. "I'm done with pretending." He nodded. "Then we'll start from here." Outside, the wind carried the scent of sage and pine down from the hills. Inside, they stood together in the hush of a place that already felt like theirs. Not because they had planned it, but because when everything else had fallen away, this was what had remained. And they would build from it. One step, one morning, one truth at a time. Rain came soft the next morning, gentle and steady, soaking into the thirsty ground without fanfare. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine bark, and a low fog clung to the ridgeline beyond the cabin. Zadie stood in the lean-to behind the house, hanging a strip of damp linens across a rope line, her fingers red from the cold. The sleeves of Everett's shirt she wore were too long, but she didn't roll them. Every so often, she paused to press the fabric to her cheek, not for warmth, but for steadiness. Everett was down by the creek with the mule, repairing the felled fence post that had washed out the week before. He hadn't asked her to help. She hadn't asked if he wanted the company. But when she brought him a tin cup of coffee wrapped in a clean rag, he looked up from the mud and said, "You always did know when to show up." She crouched beside him, watching as he tamped the soil back around the post. "It's holding better now, should be. That corner's always been stubborn." He passed her the hammer without needing to explain, and she drove the last latch into the crossbeam while he steadied it with his boot. They sat in the grass afterward, shoulder to shoulder, rain misting their faces. "Do you miss it sometimes?" she asked. "Miss what?" Riding out, moving place to place, never staying long enough to lay roots. Everett was quiet a moment, then picked a blade of grass and twisted it between his fingers. There was a time I needed to keep moving. Thought if I stayed still, I'd feel all the things I'd been trying to outrun. And now, he looked at her, rain collecting on the brim of his hat. Now I think stillness might be the only place anything good can grow. Zadie pulled her knees up and hugged them. I used to think marriage was like a cage, something a man closed around you, but it wasn't the marriage I feared. It was being unseen. You're not invisible here, I know. They didn't speak again until the mule gave a low snort and flicked its ears. Everett stood and offered his hand. This time, she didn't hesitate. Back inside, Zadie pulled the stew pot off the hook and stirred the thick broth. Everett peeled potatoes at the table, the blade of his pocketknife catching the firelight in small flashes. The room smelled of thyme and salt meat, and the windows had fogged with the warmth of the stove. "Lyle came by while you were down at the creek," she said, not looking up. Everett set down a peeled potato. "What do you want?" said the Macalls are heading east. "Levy left town last night." No word to anyone. Everett wiped his hands on a cloth. "That doesn't surprise me," he asked if I was going back to the ranch. "You tell him." I told him I wasn't the same girl who lived there. Everett leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "You sure about that?" She met his gaze. "I don't carry silence the way I used to." He stood and crossed to her, slow but certain. "Then I reckon I need to learn the language you speak now." Zadie reached for his wrist, fingers closing around the edge of his sleeve. "It's simple. You just have to stay." Everett brushed his thumb along the side of her face, a gesture so tender it made her chest ache. "I've got nowhere else I'd rather be." The fire crackled low, and the stew bubbled behind them, untouched. Outside, the rain kept falling, but inside, something had settled. Not finished, not final, but true. A kind of truth that didn't need proving. A kind of love that had taken its time and now, at last, had found still ground. The clouds broke in the middle of the week, and with the clearing came a warmth that worked into the bones. Everett was in the pasture, pacing fence line with a coil of wire slung over one shoulder and a hammer tucked into his belt. Zadie sat on the porch rail, mending a torn sleeve from one of his older shirts, the needle pricking her thumb now and again as she worked in the quiet. A wagon creaked up the trail just before noon, its wheels heavy with mud. She rose cautiously, tucking the shirt under her arm. When the rig cleared the bend, she recognized the driver before the mule even stopped. Zadie Weller's face was drawn, his hat low over tired eyes. He pulled the reins and waited instead of calling out. She stepped down from the porch, hands steady. "You didn't send word," he said. "You just left." "I didn't think you'd listen if I had," she replied. Silas shifted in his seat. "I ain't here to drag you back. Just figured it was time I saw for myself what you chose." Zadie didn't answer right away. Everett appeared from the ridge, wiping his hands on a rag, but he didn't interrupt. He stayed near the shed, watching without pressing. "You ever think," Silas said, "that maybe I didn't know how to stop you from leaving because I didn't know how to ask you to stay?" Zadie stepped closer to the wagon. "You never had to ask, you just had to see me. That's all I ever wanted." Silas looked out over the fields, his jaw working. "Your mama used to say you had too much heart for your own good. I see now she was wrong. You've just been waiting for someone who could carry it with you." She nodded once, slow and even. "He does." Silas climbed down from the wagon, not with any great show, just stiff knees and leather creaking. He looked over at Everett, then back at his daughter. "Then I reckon I've got no more use for that ranch. Sold off most the herd. I'm heading south, maybe Arizona way. Dry air might do me some good." Zadie didn't step forward. She kept her hands folded in front of her. "I hope you find what you're looking for," he gave a shallow nod. "You take care, girl." "I will." He turned, climbed back into the driver's seat, and eased the mule around without another word. She watched until the wagon disappeared behind the ridge. Everett came up then, his palms rough with wire cuts. "You all right?" "I think I am," she said. For the first time in a long while, he took the shirt from under her arm. "You finished this?" "Almost. There's a stitch near the cuff that pulled loose." "I can live with it." She smiled faintly. "I'll fix it anyway." That evening, they walked the edge of the meadow as the sun dipped low. The grass was high in places, thick with the promise of summer. Zadie bent to collect a few sprigs of wild chamomile, tucking them into her apron for drying. Everett reached for her hand and she let him take it, palm to palm. "You ever miss the town?" he asked. "No," she answered. "I never belonged to it, just passed through. You belong here, I do now." They stopped beside the old cottonwood that leaned toward the creek. He turned toward her. "I've been thinking," he said. "We've been walking the same piece of land, making the same fire, sharing the same work. Seems to me we've already built the bones of something." She looked up at him, the dim light catching the curve of his jaw. "What are you asking?" "I'm asking if you'll stay, not just for a season, not just because it's easier than leaving, but to make this a home together." Zadie's breath caught, but she didn't hesitate. "Yes." He leaned down and she met him halfway. The kiss was quiet, but certain, like setting a stone in the foundation of a house. That summer, they cleared a plot behind the cabin and planted more than beans. Squash, onions, and 3 rows of strawberries that Zadie insisted on tending herself. Everett built a second chicken coop, and together they patched the roof before the autumn rains came. In the evenings, they read aloud by lamplight or sat in the hush, hands entwined, letting the stillness speak. When the first frost came, Zadie wrapped an old quilt around Everett's shoulders as he came in from chopping wood, and he kissed her temple in thanks without saying a word. They married under the cottonwood as the leaves turned, with only the birds and the wind as witnesses. No preacher, no lace. Just a promise spoken low and sure between 2 people who had found each other not through grand gestures, but through the quiet, persistent choosing of each day. Years passed, measured not in milestones but in the rhythm of shared mornings, the feel of warm bread between them, the soft press of her hand at the small of his back when he was tired. And in that cabin at the edge of the land where the mountains met the sky, Everett and Zadie built a life not out of what they had escaped, but what they had become together. There was no more running, only staying, and love. Hard-earned, quietly kept, and never once taken for granted.